And now we move on to the development of the midgut and the hindgut, which is a little less complicated, I think. So, by way of review, the anatomy of the gut. Uh, so, now we're sort of assuming that we've gotten to the stomach, so we've gone through mouth, pharynx, esophagus, down into the stomach. We hit the duodenum, and now we're into the small intestine. So, the duodenum is the passage from the stomach into the small intestine, and that first region of small intestine is called the jejunum. The second region is the ileum, and the ileum empties into the cecum, which is the first part of the large intestine. So for the large intestine, we have the cecum and then the ascending colon. And if you look at this picture, you'll see that the large intestine sort of comes up on the person's right side, then moves across, sort of just under the stomach, that's your transverse colon, and then descends down the person's left side, your descending colon, and then it sort of heads sort of towards the exit, essentially, with the sigmoid colon followed by the rectum, which then feeds into the anal canal, and finally the anus. All right, so the midgut. How do we make a midgut? So this all starts about week 5, and you can see in sort of the first picture here, highlighted in the orange, you can see that early stomach formation, and then the rest of the gut tube sort of comes down after the stomach. And what happens during intestinal formation is that what's the future ileum, okay, so the future ileal region of the small intestine, that's elongating a lot faster than the baby's abdomen. And that causes it to form this hairpin turn, which is so named because it looks a bit like a hairpin. It's essentially a very sharp, it's a very sharp turn, so it folds back in on itself. And that's called the primary intestinal loop. The cranial end of the loop is the ileum. The caudal end will be the ascending and transverse colon. Okay. Now, weeks 6 through 8, something very interesting happens. We get what's called physiologic herniation. Basically, this is herniation of the intestinal tract into the umbilical cord, but it's supposed to happen. So as the other abdominal organs are growing, they're forcing the developing intestinal tract into the umbilical cord. Also during this time, that forces the intestinal loop to rotate because, again, of course, everything rotates. It's going to rotate clockwise, and that sort of rotation plus the pressure from the other abdominal organs forces the jejunum and the ileum to make several loops, okay, and that sort of looping structure of the bowel makes it more compact, keeps it confined within the abdomen. Additionally, at that time, you get the appendix budding off of the cecum. And that's probably all we're going to say about the appendix because it doesn't do very much and you can definitely live without it. Now, by week 10, the midgut should be back inside the abdomen. But I will say it isn't always. And sometimes on an ultrasound at 11 or 12 weeks, you'll see what appears to be the gut on the outside of the baby's body, which is in reality a physiologic herniation that hasn't made it back in yet. Now this week in some of the supplementary materials, you'll sort of look over birth defects called gastroschisis and omphalocele, and those are birth defects that occur because the intestines do not make it back into where they are supposed to be. But you can read more about that later. In the meantime, week 10, the intestinal loops are rotating again, and the mesenteries are shortening and folding. And that action by the mesenteries is pulling the organs into their final positions, keeping the intestines sort of packaged the way they're supposed to be within the abdomen. Now, in the meantime, the epithelium of the gut is also differentiating to serve its final functions. It starts out as sort of a simple epithelium, a single layer of cells, becomes a stratified epithelium, and then a simple columnar epithelium, which contains microlumens, and we talked about what those were. They eventually become open to the lumen of the intestine. Within the within the small and large intestines, we get the formation of villi, so tiny finger-like projections that help to move food and nutrients and things that you ingest along, but also provide extra surface area for absorption. In the stomach, you get the formation of pits that are going to become glands that will secrete stomach secretions, acids and such, into the stomach to aid with digestion. And again with my boxes. Okay. Continuing on this theme, The epithelial cells of the gut have a very, very high turnover rate. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. There's just sort of mechanically a lot of trauma to those epithelial cells as things bump and grind against them. There's also a lot of chemical trauma. Enzymes are released in, bile acids. All of that causes the cells that line the intestine to be damaged and to die fairly quickly. And they usually only last 3 to 6 days. So there are gut stem cells that are constantly replenishing the cells from the gut. And they can make a couple different kinds of cells. They can make enterocytes, which are sort of the classic gut cell. They absorb the nutrients from the food that passes by them. We have enteroendocrine cells, which are responsible for hormonal regulation of the gut. Paneth cells, which are the immune cells of the gut. Of course, that's very important. You probably ingest a fair number of things that could make you sick if they get far enough. And then goblet are also called mucus cells, which, as the name implies, secrete mucus. Now, also critical to the function of the gut, we have the enteric nervous system. So we chatted about this last week, sort of tantalizingly, about the fact that the gut has its own nervous system. And in fact, it can function independent of your central nervous system. So it's almost like its own little brain, although, of course, not exactly the same. But it does any number of things. It's responsible for keeping peristalsis going and for changing blood flow to the gut. So, for example, after you have a big meal, you might need more blood flowing to your gut to absorb the additional nutrients. So nutrient absorption, of course, and then secretion of mucus is regulated by the enteric nervous system, and then the endocrine system is regulated by the enteric nervous system. Now, what is the enteric nervous system? It's a combination of neurons, some of which arise outside the body. And when we talk about where neurons arise, we're talking about where their cell bodies are. So neurons whose cell bodies are in the chain ganglia of the spine, neurons whose cell bodies are within the gut itself, and there are many of those, and then they may be attached or linked by association or interneurons. So it's a complicated neurologic system. The true gut neurons, the enteric neuron ganglia, do lie within a couple different layers of the gut. They can be in the submucosa, in the muscle layer, and occasionally in humans in the lamina propria, although not as many. Okay. Finally, onto the hindgut, and this will be a little bit. So finally, onto the hindgut. Now, here we're going to just sort of quickly refresh anatomy of the gut. We're looking at the caudal end of the gut, so that's shown here, and then the hindgut terminates in the cloaca, and you also see the allantois, which we will bring up briefly here as well. So basically, the cloaca is the very caudal end of the gut tube or of the hindgut, and within the cloaca, a urorectal septum forms, and that's going to divide the cloaca into the anorectal canal and the urogenital sinus, and this is all occurring between weeks 4 and 6. Now, the urogenital sinus, which is what we're focusing on for this particular week, from that forms the bladder, the urethra in both male and females, and urethra is the tube that leads urine out from the bladder to the exterior of the body. And then also the phallic segment is derived from the urogenital sinus. In males, that's going to become the penile urethra, so the urethra, the portion of the urethra that's within the penis. In females, it becomes the vaginal vestibule. Now, interestingly, your book points out that while the commonly accepted wisdom is that the bladder is derived from the urogenital sinus, it may actually be derived from a portion of the allantois. More to be discovered there, but an interesting idea. And finally, about week 8, the cloacal membrane will rupture, which creates the anal opening, and now the tube, by this point, should actually be open at both ends.